On the Iranian front, it seems interesting because it looks like, and again, this is very early to tell, but if we're looking at what we have so far, that Trump is pursuing a diplomatic angle at resolving, something like a new nuclear deal or some kind of diplomatic resolution to the tensions with Iran. The center of that being Iran having a nuclear program and the US wanting to prevent Iran from deciding to weaponize that program, which, as we're speaking right now, there is no evidence that Iran has weaponized that program, according to US intelligence, I should say. The fact that there is a administration on the Iranian side that has also signaled that it's open to dialogue is maybe favorable, because one of the problems sort of on the Iranian American sides is they often don't line up. There's on one side, they're open to dialogue, on the other side, they reject it, or vice versa. And right now, if we take what we've seen so far from the Trump administration to be true, then you may see that line up now, which would be, what we saw the first time in Trump 1.0, what we saw was someone who came in and wanted to reverse and be distinct from his predecessor, which was at the time Barack Obama. If he follows that same path now, which seems to be what he would want to do, then, and this is at least the discourse that he has used, he wants to end all of these wars. He wants the war in Ukraine to end. He wants the war in Gaza to end. He wants to have a deal with Iran, because basically that'll give him the ability to come out and say, look, I did everything they couldn't do. I ended all of these things.
I think I can definitely see what you're getting at. I mean, that's been a lot of the reporting here, that's been, it's kind of early days, obviously. I have to ask, I mean, domestically in Iran, how easy, how difficult will a kind of a deal with Trump, I mean, the person who assassinated Soleimani, be to sort of sell to people?
Domestically, I don't actually think that. So that specific point will be objected to by a minority within the population, right? Because it'll be sort of like the hardliners will take the stance of, Trump assassinated Soleimani, and so we can't negotiate with this person. I think that represents more of a hardline view that actually cares deeply about the fact that he assassinated Soleimani. I think within the larger population, you'll also see some differences where there's probably one camp that would like to see the economic situation improve, right? And I think that typically, even if you take the Iranian populace out of it and you just think across the board, what was the number one factor in our own election? We can talk about Gaza, we can talk about genocide, we can talk about all sorts of things. The reality of it is the number one issue for Americans was the economy. And so that's going to be the case with everybody, right? People are always worried about their basic necessities over anything else. And so sanctions relief and the potential for Iran's economy to improve would definitely be something that I think would have appeal for a lot of the population. Now, I say that, and I would add that there's probably another camp that doesn't want to see negotiations, not for the same reasons as the hardliners, right? Not because, but he assassinated Soleimani, but they don't want to see negotiations because they don't want anything that might engage with the Islamic Republic and therefore keep it in power, under the belief that there is some alternative, or, somehow it can be overthrown. And even that, it'll split into different camps again, right? I would say it's a minority view, but people who might support, for instance, military intervention, regime change from the outside. I think that's a minority view in Iran. But, it's a massive country. We're talking about nearly 90 million people, right? 85 million people. They're going to have a diverse set of views, but those are the few nuances that I think are important to understand. But specifically in terms of negotiating with Trump because of Soleimani, I think that would be more of like a hardline view.
Yeah, I can definitely see how achieving a deal would be very popular, probably also in the U.S. With normal people. Maybe not as much with the freaks. On that, we've talked about this when you please, yeah.
You say that because actually, like, everything I just said sort of flip side works too, right? Like, if you think about how would the American populace respond to a deal with Iran, it's very similar. Like, you'll have the sort of hawkish hardline views in the US that's like, you can't negotiate with them because you just can't. They're morally repugnant and therefore you can't negotiate with them. You can negotiate with everybody else who's morally repugnant and arm them, but you can't negotiate with these people. Then you'll have people who will be like, thank God, right? Like, we don't have to have a war. We get to avoid anything like that. And Iran's not going to have nuclear weapons. And then you'll have people who will also be sort of part of that. No, we should just get rid of the Islamic Republic camp. So it's very similar. They're sort of mirror images of each other in the sense of the types of thinking that you'll see across the political spectrum. But I would argue that a majority on both sides would like to avoid conflict, war, and see, I mean, if you're on the Iranian side, see your daily life improve through economic improvement.
Which I mean, there's a few other things I was hoping to get to before we let you go. But if you could just remind people, we've had you on the program. I'll link to our other interviews here for folks. But I mean, you can agree with me or disagree with me, but like, I think it is repugnant the fact that Joe Biden did not make an effort to undo what Trump did. It's politically no brainer. Could you just help people who are less familiar with this understand like the real suffering, that Joe Biden maintaining that Trump tearing up the nuclear deal has meant for everyday Iranians?
Look, so I just brought up the fact that there's probably like a population of people in Iran who don't want negotiations because they're so fed up and angry and frustrated that they just want to get rid of this government, however, by any means necessary, and therefore they don't want engagement, right? Now, let's go back to 2016. This is the same country, it's the same people, it's the same government. People in Iran celebrated the nuclear deal. There's just no question to this. Like, you can look at footage, you can anecdotally look at things, you can look at election results, how many people participated in elections in 2013 and 2017 as comparatively to the last two elections, and the fact that you had massive voter turnout then, which typically is seen as like a mandate, right? When people actually go out to vote, it means that they're voting for something. And then you could just look at polling. Everything across the board shows you that it was very, very popular, the nuclear deal with the United States. And obviously it's the P5+1. It's a global, it's an international accord. But the fact that the US was involved in it was significant for Iranians because they saw it at the time, not just because of the economic relief from sanctions, but also as this turning point, right? It was the detente between Iran and the US was huge for Iranians. They thought this is going to be a turning point. Things are going to change now. Because it was also understood at the time, for those who were within the sort of pro-diplomacy camps, that the JCPOA wasn't a ceiling, but a floor to diplomacy, right? It was the beginning, and you could build on it. And so when Trump withdraws from the deal about 2 years later, and not only reimposes sanctions, but unleashes this notion of maximum pressure, it hurt. And this was predictable, right? Every analyst at the time, not every analyst, I take that back. How can I say this? Pro-diplomacy analysts, I guess. I want to say honest analysts, honestly, said this would hurt ordinary people more than anybody else. And that's not just in the case of Iran. That's typically how sanctions work. You can look at reports by sanctions experts. Even proponents of sanctions will tell you that the evidence shows in terms of efficacy, they don't work more than they work, if that makes sense, right? Most of the time, they don't work, especially when they're unilateral. And that's what the US did under the Trump administration in 2018. So you saw massive inflation, just the currency has basically become worthless. Millions of people from the middle class forced into poverty. Lack of access to, not only are goods very expensive, but the goods on the market have changed. Even medicines, right? Like even the humanitarian carve-outs, the things that are not supposed to be sanctioned, like essential goods, were. And this is something, by the way, that Joe Biden said. Go back to 2020. You know who said that despite the humanitarian exceptions and sanctions, essential goods were being impeded because of US sanctions? Joe Biden said that when he was a candidate. And guess who didn't lift any of those sanctions? Joe Biden. So the economic situation is very, very dire for the population at large. The Islamic Republic is still in power. And economically, they don't really suffer because they have the ability to get around these sanctions. They can do it. They can sell oil on the black market. They can do these things. Ordinary people can't get around them and can't do anything. So yeah, that's the sort of gravity of the situation that Iranians find themselves. Now, on top of that, domestically, they have an authoritarian, repressive government. We've seen protests in 2019 and 2022, sparked by different reasons, right? In 2019, because of economic reasons. In 2022, because of social reasons, the hijab, the mandatory hijab for women, after the killing of Mahsa Amini. So they have very large and significant and legitimate grievances across the board, but the economic situation has been exacerbated by sanctions without a doubt. There's no doubt to that. That's just the evidence. I mean, US administrations have actually boasted about that fact. Like, look, our sanctions are working. Their economy is terrible. Mm-hmm. So this is the information. This is what our own officials in the US are saying about their sanctions policy.
The Iran deal has always been one of the best legacies of Obama. Like, looking back on it, especially after Biden's term, is it almost surprising how it got done at all? Like, how did that get through?
Like I said, remember I said they're usually not aligned. Like, if you look at the history of Iran and the US from the post-revolutionary era, right, like post-1979, there has been a lot of attempts at engagement actually from the Iranian side. There have been many attempts at engagement, and it has usually been rebuffed by repeated US administrations. And we could dedicate a whole other hour to talking about all of that history and why that happened the way that it did. I think obviously one part of that history that plays into it so much on the American side is the embassy seizure of 1979, right? That was a national humiliation. It was a national crisis that went on for 444 days. It was the major reason why Jimmy Carter did not get reelected. Similarly to sort of what we saw in the ceasefire, the fact that the ceasefire went into effect right as Trump was being inaugurated is precisely what we saw in 1980 when Reagan was taking office, right? Basically the hostages were held until Reagan was inaugurated as president, and then they were released. So that is a very important historical moment in the American psyche. Of course, like I said, we could talk about this for a long time. That is directly related historically to something that's part of the Iranian psyche, which is the 1953 coup, that CIA-led, CIA, US, UK, that removed its democratic prime minister and reimposed a dictator, the Shah. So there's a lot, that's why I said there's so much we can sort of unpack about it. But the problem has been this alignment. And what you saw under the Obama administration is they finally aligned. There was a moderate Hassan Rouhani, who was in the administration then, the foreign minister was Javad Zarif. And for them, the crowning achievement was the JCPOA. This is what they had worked for. This is what they had promised people. Because again, it was, for the Iranian side, it was about economic relief, which was vital, very, very important, but also a pivot, a change, because so many of the people who were against, and I'm talking about on the US side, on the American side, so many of the pundits you would listen to would say things like, Iran can't be trusted. Iran would never negotiate with the US. Iran would never abide by a deal. And now we have a very unique sort of historical situation where we know as a fact that none of that is true. Iran did negotiate with the US. They sat at the table and had dialogue with the United States. They signed an agreement and they abided by that agreement. So much so that the Trump admin certified the deal multiple times before they pulled out of it in May of 2018. And so that means when they certified the deal, they were saying Iran is abiding by it, right? A key thing, since we're sort of catching people up, the key thing to keep in mind, like what happened in the Trump administration is Trump changed his Secretary of State. under Rex Tillerson, who was the original Secretary of State under Trump 1.0, the U.S. stayed in the deal and certified it. It was within 2 weeks of Mike Pompeo taking over as Secretary of State that the U.S. withdrew from the deal. And of course, if you know anything about Mike Pompeo, he is basically an extremist, right? He's a religious extremist. He has highly ideological points of view that color his idea of foreign policy. I mean, he was asked if he thought God had brought Trump to protect Israel from Iran, and he responded basically that he had to entertain that idea as a believer. It was a possibility. Yeah. Like, this is what your Secretary of State is saying. These are the things that we criticize, by the way, right? If a cleric in Iran was to make a similar statement, this would be criticized across the board in the United States. But the Secretary of State can say that, and we're sort of like, okay.
You know, something happens when it's that far away, you know, over the ocean, you know.
They're religious fanatics. We're pragmatic politicians.
Just like the founders.
Yeah, I mean,
he makes the same argument about, he was the one that basically said, I mean, he recognized settlements in the West Bank, the first U.S. administration to go against the entire international community to do so, because he's using essentially a biblical justification for why that land does not apparently belong to Palestinians. So this is the kind of thinking that you had at that time that, again, made it impossible for the two sides to come to any kind of agreement. That is why it was actually very interesting to see that Trump did not bring Mike Pompeo back to this administration. We'll have to see how Secretary of State Rubio, who's also hawkish on Iran, very, very pro-Israel, like Trump did not bring a cabinet that's necessarily that different, I should say, but if there's more pragmatism within their thinking rather than strictly ideological, then there might be space, especially because Biden failed to do it. So what a great sort of endorsement of his presidency it would be if he again accomplishes something that Biden failed to do.